The one thing, Gary Keller. There is a quiet paradox governing modern life. We have more tools than ever to save time, yet we have never felt so short on it. We work faster, communicate more, do more things, and still, something essential always seems to slip through our fingers. Perhaps the problem has never been a lack of effort. Perhaps it's a lack of direction. The One Thing by Gary Keller begins exactly where few people dare to look, at the excess that distracts us from what truly matters. Here is an uncomfortable, but liberating, truth. Most people don't fail because they lack talent, but because they live scattered. Scattered across commitments, expectations, and urgencies they never consciously chose. We live as if everything is important, and that is precisely why almost nothing has depth. The cost isn't just exhaustion, it's a life only half lived. You may recognize this feeling. You wake up with a racing mind, spend the day putting out fires, and go to bed with the strange sense that you were busy but not truly present. This is where this philosophical video takes a different path. We're not talking about doing more. We're talking about living better. About reclaiming clarity of purpose in a world addicted to distraction. When we look at the one thing through a deeper lens, we realize it's not just about mindful productivity. It's about essential choices. About existential minimalism. About the courage to say no to noise so you can say yes to what sustains inner growth. It reminds us of something simple yet forgotten. Focus doesn't limit life, it reveals it. Throughout this reflective video in audiobook form, I want to walk with you through this process. From silent discomfort to calm clarity. From dispersion to presence and awareness. Not with urgency, not with magic formulas, but with depth, humanity, and practical application. Because in the end, living well isn't about doing everything, it's about choosing well. And that choice can begin now. The noise of the world and the hunger for clarity. I want to start with a truth that may sting a little, but that almost everyone feels in silence. Most of us aren't tired because we work too much. We're tired because we think too much, decide too much, and scatter ourselves too much. The world has become far too loud for a mind that needs silence in order to flourish. And that constant noise doesn't just come from the outside. It seeps into us, filling every crack of our attention, fragmenting presence, and draining vital energy. When I read The One Thing by Gary Keller, I realized he wasn't just talking about mindful productivity, but about something deeper. An ancient hunger for clarity of purpose. You may recognize this sensation. You wake up already tired, even after a full night's sleep. You open your eyes and your mind is already indebted to the world. Messages, commitments, expectations, poorly defined goals, promises you made just to keep the peace. Everything shouts at once. And in the middle of that chaos, you try to handle it all, believing this is what maturity, responsibility, and high performance look like. But deep down, a question whispers, why do I always feel busy yet rarely at peace? The problem isn't a lack of capacity. It never was. It's an excess of stimuli competing for the same mental space. The psychology of focus has long shown that attention is a finite resource, yet modern culture insists on treating it as infinite. With every notification, every new task, every just one more thing, a piece of our presence dissolves. Spiritually, the cost is high. We are physically present but emotionally absent from our own lives. It's like always running late to meet yourself. I remember a phase of my life when I confused movement with progress. My calendar was full, my to-do list overflowing, and still there was a void I couldn't explain. I produced, delivered, solved, but I didn't feel meaning. That's when I realized that productivity without direction is just an elegant form of burnout. The One Thing begins by dismantling this illusion. It's not a lack of time, it's a lack of essential focus. There's something almost spiritual about admitting this. Because acknowledging the chaos is the first act of inner honesty. It's saying, something here is out of alignment. The existential minimalism woven between the lines of the book isn't about doing less out of laziness, but about doing less out of respect for the soul. Every unconscious yes is a small no to what truly matters. And most of us don't notice when we cross that line, we only feel the weight afterward. Maybe you've tried to fix this by adding more techniques, more systems, more productivity apps. I did too. But noise doesn't decrease when you add tools, it decreases when you eliminate the unnecessary. Clarity isn't born from accumulation, it's born from choice. And choice requires courage because it means leaving things behind. This is where Gary Keller's book reveals itself less as a productivity manual and more as a philosophy of attention. Notice how the world rewards dispersion disguised as versatility. The person who does everything seems admirable. The one who's always available seems generous. But over time, that availability becomes an invisible prison. You start living reactively instead of intentionally. And living that way erodes inner growth, because life becomes defined by what's urgent, not by what's essential. This is one of modernity's quietest traps. When I talk about focus, I'm not talking about rigidity or isolation. I'm talking about presence and awareness, about being fully in one thing at a time, about giving the mind permission to rest on a single point. This changes everything: how you work, how you relate, how you listen, how you decide. And slowly, something curious happens. The exhaustion lessens even if the effort remains, because now there is meaning. A simple practice I began adopting, and that you can try, is to observe for a few days where your attention actually goes. Not where you think it goes, but where it's stolen. Write it down. No judgment, just awareness. This small exercise starts revealing the invisible noise that governs your days. And that's exactly where clarity begins to emerge, when you see without filters what's draining your vital energy. At its core, this first movement is a quiet awakening. Not an external revolution, but an internal adjustment. It's realizing that life isn't asking for more speed, it's asking for direction. And when that realization settles in, an inevitable question begins to form, still timid, still subtle. A question with the power to reorganize not just your calendar, but your very identity. The big lie of multitasking. There is an idea deeply rooted in our culture that goes something like this: the more things you can do at once, the more valuable you are. I believed that for many years. Maybe you do too. Multitasking was sold to us as a sign of intelligence, efficiency, and peak human performance. But the One Thing by Gary Keller exposes an uncomfortable truth. Multitasking isn't a skill, it's fragmentation disguised as virtue. When we try to do many things at the same time, what actually happens isn't simultaneity, but rapid task switching. The mind jumps from one point to another like someone trying to watch 10 movies at once, without fully entering any of them. The psychology of focus has already shown that this behavior increases errors, anxiety, and mental fatigue. And yet we persist, not because it works, but because we're afraid of seeming inadequate if we slow down. Spiritually, multitasking exacts an even subtler toll. It pulls us away from presence and awareness. You may be physically there, but your mind is always one step ahead, preoccupied with what's next. This creates a constant sense of urgency, as if life were perpetually behind schedule. No wonder so many people feel that time flies, yet lacks depth. When we are divided, life becomes shallow. I remember replying to messages while talking to someone I loved. My body was there, my mind wasn't. And the strangest part is that, at the time, this felt normal. I'll pay attention later, I told myself, but later never came. It was in these everyday moments that I realized how multitasking erodes the quality of human experience. Not just at work, but in relationships, in practical spirituality, in inner silence. Gary Keller is direct. Doing many things at once doesn't speed up results. It delays what truly matters. And this resonates deeply with ancient contemplative traditions, which have always taught the value of being whole in a single act. Washing dishes as a ritual. Walking as meditation. Working as an extension of identity. Profound simplicity is born from wholeness. You might be thinking, but the world demands this of me. I understand. I thought that too. But there's a difference between external demands and internal choices. Often we accept fragmentation as the norm without questioning it. The book invites us to break this belief, not through rebellion but through lucidity. Because when everything seems equally important, nothing ever receives the best of you. A simple and powerful practice is to experiment with conscious single-tasking in short blocks of time. Choose one task and do only that for 25 minutes. No extra tabs, no notifications, no self-imposed interruptions. Then stop. Breathe. Notice how you feel. Most people discover something surprising. Less fatigue, more clarity, more presence. This is mindful productivity in action, not as a technique but as an existential stance. There's also an emotional component hidden in multitasking, a fear of emptiness. When we're always busy, we don't have to face ourselves. Silence is unsettling. Focus is unsettling. Because to focus is to confront what truly matters, and that brings responsibility. By scattering ourselves, we postpone essential choices. The problem is that the bill comes due later, in the form of diffuse frustration and the sense of a life not fully lived. At its core, multitasking is an attempt to control an unpredictable world. We do more to feel in control. But the paradox is cruel. The more we try to control everything, the less internal control we have. The One Thing points in the opposite direction. Fewer actions, more intention. Less dispersion, more clarity of purpose. And that requires unlearning before learning. When you begin to abandon multitasking, something shifts in your internal rhythm. Time seems to expand. Decisions become clearer. The mind grows quieter, not because life got easier but because you stopped fighting the nature of human attention. And in this newly created space, a new question begins to take shape. A question that doesn't ask for speed, but for direction, and that can reorganize your entire life around a single point. The question that organizes life. There are moments when life doesn't ask for more effort, it asks for the right question. And for me, this was the quietest and most powerful moment in The One Thing by Gary Keller. There were no fireworks, no euphoria. Just a calm, almost meditative discomfort. The question is simple but not comfortable. What's the one thing I can do right now such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? When this sentence lands in the mind, it doesn't demand urgency. It demands honesty. Notice how this question slows everything down. It interrupts the automatic impulse to do more and invites us to do better. This isn't a typical productivity question, it's a question of purpose. Because when you answer it, you're not just organizing tasks, you're organizing your life. It's as if the noise suddenly fades and only the essential remains, exposed and distraction-free. I remember the first time I truly tried to answer it. The response wasn't glamorous or heroic. It was simple, almost mundane. And it may be the same for you. The mind craves grand answers, but essential focus often reveals itself through small, consistent actions. Sometimes the one thing is getting better sleep. Other times it's studying deeply. In certain seasons, it's having a difficult conversation you've been postponing for months. This question also exposes a curious detail about the psychology of focus. We tend to confuse what's important with what's urgent. The urgent shouts, the important whispers. When you ask yourself what the one thing is, you have to quiet the external noise to hear that inner voice. That's why this question carries a sense of practical spirituality. It requires presence and awareness, not just logic. A practical way to apply this in daily life is to focus on one domain at a time. Work, health, relationships, or inner growth. Ask yourself, what here truly moves the needle? At work, it might not be answering more emails but deepening a key skill. Reading a specific book, like Deep Work by Cal Newport, may yield more than weeks of scattered effort. With your body, it might be walking every day rather than chasing elaborate workout plans. There's also discomfort hidden in this question. Because once you discover the one thing, you can no longer pretend you don't know. Clarity creates responsibility. And this is where many people retreat. They prefer staying busy to committing to an essential choice. In that sense, dispersion acts like emotional anesthesia. Focus, by contrast, wakes you up. Gary Keller addresses this with rare honesty. Meaningful success doesn't come from doing everything, but from doing what matters long enough. This requires patience in a world addicted to instant results. It requires trusting that deep simplicity builds something more solid than constant agitation. And interestingly, when you begin living this way, anxiety decreases, because the mind knows exactly where it's investing its energy. I often suggest a simple ritual. Every morning before checking your phone, write down your one thing for the day. Just one. Not three. Not five. One. If you do only that, the day is already a success. Everything else becomes a bonus. This practice changes your relationship with time and with self-worth. You stop measuring yourself by quantity and begin measuring by intention. Over time, this question spills into other areas of life. It starts organizing bigger decisions. Where to invest energy, whom to walk with, what to let go of. And something curious happens. Focus stops being a technique and becomes an identity in formation. Because what you consistently choose begins to define who you are. And it's precisely here that a new internal conflict emerges. Because choosing one thing isn't just about prioritizing tasks. It's about confronting the image you have of yourself and the image others expect from you. And when those two collide, the question stops being comfortable and becomes transformative. Priority is not a list, it's identity. There's a very common and very dangerous confusion when we talk about priority. Most people believe that prioritizing simply means organizing a to-do list more efficiently. But over time, I realized that's only the surface. Deep down, we don't do what's most important. We do what confirms who we believe we are. The One Thing by Gary Keller points to this quiet space where mindful productivity meets identity. Priority isn't a schedule. It's a mirror. Notice how your daily choices reveal far more than your words. You may say you value health, but if you never protect time for your body, something is misaligned. You may say you want inner growth, but if you never create space for silence, reading, or reflection, it remains an abstract intention. The psychology of focus shows that behavior follows self-image. We change when we change the story we tell ourselves about who we are. I lived this very concretely. For years, I saw myself as someone who was always available. It looked like a virtue, but it was fear in disguise. Fear of disappointing others, of losing relevance, of not being needed. My priorities reflected that. Many demands met, little depth lived. When I began applying Gary Keller's teachings, I realized that before changing what I did, I had to change who I believed I was. There's a powerful spiritual component here. Identity is devotion. What you protect with your time becomes sacred even if you never say it out loud. Time is a silent vow. When you start protecting your one thing, you're making an internal declaration. This matters more than external approval. This is a deep form of practical spirituality, lived day by day. You may feel some discomfort right now, and it's legitimate, because changing priorities affects relationships, expectations, even family roles. When you stop being the one who fixes everything, some people feel unsettled. Others resist. And an unspoken question arises. Who will I be if I'm not everything to everyone? This is one of the most delicate moments in personal development, because the ego tries to negotiate focus to keep the old identity alive. A simple but revealing practice is to notice how you describe yourself. I'm busy. I'm a multitasker. I handle everything. These phrases seem harmless, but they shape decisions. Try replacing them with something like, I'm someone who protects what's essential, or, I'm disciplined about what matters. At first it feels awkward. Then it begins to guide choices almost automatically. Gary Keller speaks of essential focus as an ongoing commitment, not a one-time event. That means identity must be reinforced daily, especially when the world tries to pull you back into dispersion. Simple habits help here. Reading a few pages each day from books that reinforce this mindset, like Essentialism by Greg McKeown, acts as a quiet reminder of who you're becoming. What's interesting is that when identity begins to align with choices, effort decreases. You need less willpower because acting in line with your priorities becomes coherent with who you are. Emotional discipline stops being a struggle and becomes a natural reflex. This is real human high performance, sustained inner coherence over time. But don't be mistaken, this alignment carries an emotional cost. Because when you affirm a more focused identity, you inevitably clash with external expectations. And that's exactly where the next obstacle appears, quiet and powerful, the fear of saying no. A fear more imprisoning than any lack of method, and one that must be faced with conscious courage. The fear of saying no and the prison of approval. There comes a point when focus stops being a matter of method and becomes a matter of courage. Because every real choice requires renunciation. And renunciation in practice almost always means saying no. No to invitations. No to demands. No to other people's expectations. The One Thing by Gary Keller doesn't romanticize this moment. It reveals something many avoid facing. Focus has an emotional price, and that price is disapproval. The fear of saying no is rarely rational. It grows from a deep desire to belong, to be accepted, to be seen as good, competent, and reliable. Psychologically, it's tied to our need for validation. Spiritually, it's a way of outsourcing our self-worth. When you live to please, your choices stop being essential and become reactive. Slowly, your life is shaped by agendas that aren't yours. I lived for a long time in this invisible prison. I said yes before thinking. And when I realized it, my energy was already committed to things that didn't contribute to my inner growth. The irony is that I felt responsible for everything, except myself. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Every time I said yes to the superfluous, I was saying no to my one thing. And that no was silent and cumulative. Gary Keller reminds us that essential choices don't coexist well with a constant need for approval. Because those who focus will disappoint others. That's not a character flaw, it's a logical consequence. If you protect what matters, someone will feel overlooked. If you honor your time, someone will interpret it as selfishness. And here lies one of the book's deepest lessons. Not every criticism signals a mistake. Sometimes it signals alignment. There's a vast difference between being selfish and being faithful to yourself. Selfishness ignores others. Inner fidelity respects limits. When you start saying no with clarity and kindness, something shifts in how the world organizes itself around you. Some demands disappear. Others adjust. And the ones that remain become more honest. This is mindful productivity applied to human relationships. A simple and liberating practice is to create standard responses to protect your energy. Phrases like, I can't take this on with quality right now, or, this isn't aligned with my priorities at the moment. That's not coldness, it's emotional maturity. Over time, you realize that saying no doesn't break genuine bonds. It simply reveals which relationships were sustained by your overavailability. The fear of missing out also shows up strongly here. The mind whispers, what if this is the last opportunity? But the philosophy of attention teaches something counterintuitive. Aligned opportunities return. Distractions only multiply. When you choose with clarity, the path narrows, and that isn't loss, it's direction. Deep simplicity requires letting go of what merely takes up space. There is a quiet grief in this process, the grief of the version of you who tried to please everyone. Allowing that version to die is painful but necessary, because on the other side, someone more whole is born, more present, more coherent. Someone who understands that meaningful success doesn't come from the number of open doors, but from the courage to walk through a few with depth. And it's precisely after this emotional confrontation that something begins to rebuild from within. When no stops being a threat and becomes protection, a new relationship with discipline emerges, not as an external imposition but as an intimate act. Discipline as a form of self-love. After we learn to say no to what scatters us, a new space opens up, and with it, a quiet question arises: how do I protect day by day what I have chosen to honor? This is where discipline enters the picture. But not harsh, punitive, rigid discipline. The One Thing by Gary Keller invites us to see discipline as devotion, as a continuous act of self-love applied to real life. For a long time, I associated discipline with deprivation, forcing myself to wake up early, following soulless routines, constantly resisting. That model always led me to burnout. What the book proposes is something subtler and far more sustainable. Emotional discipline as an intimate agreement with yourself. Not to become someone better in the eyes of others, but to protect what gives meaning to your own existence. When you are clear about your one thing, discipline changes its role. It stops being a heroic effort and becomes a simple system. You no longer need to decide every day whether you will act. The decision has already been made in advance. This frees up mental energy and reduces emotional fatigue. The psychology of focus shows that the brain tires less when it operates within predictable structures aligned with values. A practical example: if your one thing involves deep learning, don't rely on motivation. Create a fixed, short, protected time block for studying. 30 minutes a day, always at the same time. Choose books that deepen awareness, such as The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle or Deep Work by Cal Newport. It's not about quantity, it's about consistency. Profound simplicity is born from conscious repetition. Spiritually, discipline is an invisible altar. What you do every day, even when no one is watching, shapes who you become. There is something sacred about maintaining a silent commitment to what is essential. And this creates a rare sense of inner integrity in today's world. You begin to trust yourself more because your actions confirm your intentions. It's important to say this: discipline doesn't eliminate discomfort, but it gives it meaning. There will be days when you won't want to focus, protect your time, or maintain the ritual. In those moments, discipline acts as a gentle reminder. This isn't about willpower, it's about direction. This shift in perspective transforms effort into care. You're not forcing yourself, you're taking care of yourself. A rarely discussed detail is that well-applied discipline actually increases freedom. It sounds paradoxical, but it's real. The more you protect what's essential, the less you have to deal with artificial urgencies. Life becomes more predictable, lighter, more breathable. This is mindful productivity at its most human level. Less chaos, more inner space. It's also crucial to adjust expectations. Discipline is not perfection. There will be failures, interruptions, chaotic days. The point isn't never leaving the path, but knowing how to return without guilt. Guilt drains energy, responsibility restores power. That distinction completely changes the way you relate to yourself. When discipline settles in this way, gentle, firm, and conscious, something begins to call for external structure. You realize that to sustain focus, you need to protect time in more concrete ways. Not just with intention but with visible boundaries. And that's when the next step reveals itself. Treating time not as a resource but as something sacred. Time blocking, life protected. There comes a moment when inner clarity must take shape in the concrete world. Knowing what is essential is not enough. You must create space for it to exist. The One Thing by Gary Keller treats time as something to be defended with the same seriousness with which we defend what we love. And when we look closely, we realize, what doesn't make it onto the calendar rarely makes it into life. Time blocking is not a cold productivity technique. It's a symbolic act. It's saying without words that something is worthy of protection. When you reserve time for your one thing, you turn time into an altar. This is one of the book's deepest ideas. Even though it's presented simply, time reveals priorities more clearly than any speech. Intentional living begins on the calendar. I resisted this idea at first. It felt too rigid. What I didn't realize was that the lack of structure was costing me freedom. My days were reactive, fragmented, constantly interrupted. When I began protecting blocks of time, even small ones, something changed. My mind relaxed because it knew there would be space for what mattered. Anxiety decreases when clarity finds form. A practical application is to choose your best time of day, the period when your energy feels cleanest, and reserve it for your one thing. It could be early morning, it could be at night. Consistency matters more than the hour itself. During that block, everything else waits. Phone on silent, notifications off, a simple environment. This isn't isolation, it's presence. This is the philosophy of attention applied to daily life. Gary Keller talks about large blocks of time, but depth isn't about duration, it's about quality. Even 40 minutes of true focus are worth more than hours of dispersion. The psychology of focus confirms this. Deep attention generates exponential results. And gradually, you realize the world doesn't fall apart because you were unavailable for a while. On the contrary, it adapts. There's an important emotional layer here as well. Protecting time requires facing guilt, that feeling that you should be available, responding, fixing things. But that guilt is a remnant of the old identity. When it arises, it's worth remembering. Protecting what's essential isn't neglecting the rest. It's ensuring you actually have something real to offer. No one benefits from an exhausted version of you. A simple exercise: review your calendar from the past week and observe where your time went. No judgment. Just observe. Then ask yourself, does this reflect the life I say I want to live? Questions like this align presence and awareness with practical action. And that alignment creates a rare sense of integrity. Over time, time blocking begins to spill into other areas. You start protecting moments of rest, silence, and connection. Life becomes less chaotic and more breathable. Existential minimalism stops being a concept and becomes a lived experience. Fewer things competing for your attention, more depth in every choice. And when time begins to reflect who you are, a new and unavoidable reflection arises. What kind of success am I building with this focus? Because protecting time means little if the destination doesn't resonate with your essence. That distinction is exactly what the next topic will reveal with clarity. Aligned success versus empty success. There's a question almost no one asks while chasing results. Is this worth the life it's costing me? The One Thing by Gary Keller leads us to this point gently but without softening the truth. Not all success is the same. Some forms expand us inwardly, others merely keep us busy on the outside. Learning to distinguish between the two is one of the great acts of maturity in personal development. Empty success tends to be loud. It shows up as recognition, numbers, targets hit, packed schedules. From the outside, everything looks like it's working. On the inside, something slowly erodes. Aligned success, on the other hand, is quiet. It manifests as inner coherence, clarity of purpose, and a sense of being in the right place, even when the path is demanding. The difference isn't obvious, which is why so many people only notice it too late. I've been in phases where the results came, but the joy didn't stay. It felt like achieving something and then immediately sensing an emptiness that was hard to explain. That happens when high performance is disconnected from essence. In those cases, focus exists, but it's pointed outward, not inward. The One Thing reminds us that focus without meaning only accelerates burnout. The philosophy of attention serves as a compass here. Where you place your attention, you place your life. If focus is centered solely on external goals, identity begins to rely on applause and validation. When the applause fades, the ground disappears. But when focus is aligned with values, success stops being fragile. It may fluctuate externally, but it remains stable internally. A practical way to assess this is to notice how you feel at the end of the day. Tired? Yes. Empty? No. The fatigue of aligned success comes with a kind of calm satisfaction. The fatigue of empty success comes with irritation, anxiety, or apathy. This is a powerful emotional gauge, yet rarely used. Practical spirituality begins precisely in this refined listening to body and mind. Gary Keller doesn't condemn ambition. On the contrary, he invites us to refine it. Ambition without direction is just diffuse desire. Ambition with essential focus becomes contribution. When you choose one thing aligned with who you are, the impact tends to be deeper and more lasting. Less dispersion, more legacy. Less sprinting, more path. It's also important to recognize that aligned success requires patience. It grows slowly, almost invisibly. It doesn't impress right away. but it sustains. It's like a tree with deep roots. It doesn't appear overnight, but it withstands storms. The profound simplicity of focus protects you from trading meaning for speed. Perhaps the most honest question you can ask yourself right now is this: if no one were watching, would I still choose this path? That question dismantles illusions gently but firmly. It brings presence and awareness back to the center of decision-making. And when you begin answering it truthfully, something reorganizes within. This is where the journey proposed by the one thing reveals its greatest beauty. Focus isn't about producing more, it's about living better. And when that understanding settles in, life naturally simplifies. Not through deprivation but through depth. A kind of life that doesn't need excess to be extraordinary. A simple, intentional, and extraordinary life. After moving through noise, breaking illusions, facing fears, and rebuilding habits, something becomes clear. Focus doesn't impoverish life, it deepens it. The One Thing by Gary Keller doesn't lead to a smaller existence, but to a cleaner, more honest, more whole life. The simplicity that emerges here isn't lack. It's excess falling away because it no longer serves a purpose. Living intentionally means accepting that not everything deserves your energy. And paradoxically, that brings lightness. When you choose consciously, the weight lifts. The mind becomes less congested, the heart calmer. The philosophy of attention shows that clarity doesn't come from adding, but from removing. Every essential choice creates space for presence and awareness to emerge naturally. I noticed this when my days began to have more room to breathe. Not because I did less, but because I did what mattered. Decisions became simpler. My body less tense. My mind less defensive. This is one of the subtlest signs of inner growth. You no longer need to constantly convince yourself that you're on the right path. You feel it. There is a quiet beauty in a life organized around a few well-chosen things. Deeper relationships, meaningful work, rest without guilt. Existential minimalism doesn't eliminate pleasure. It refines it. A cup of coffee enjoyed with presence is worth more than 10 taken distractedly. One well-cared-for project is worth more than many left unfinished. This is meaningful success lived in everyday life. At this point, practical spirituality stops being something separate from ordinary life. It shows up in how you start your day, how you speak to people, how you respect your limits. Everything becomes practice. Everything becomes a field of awareness. Essential focus is no longer a technique. It's a way of being in the world. A clear sign that this integration is happening is a decrease in hurry. Not in action but in inner urgency. You remain committed, responsible, productive, but without that constant feeling of being late for your own life. Aligned high performance has this steady, serene rhythm. There's also more room for the unexpected. When life isn't cluttered with excess, it can breathe. Creativity flows more freely. Relationships deepen. Decisions emerge with greater clarity. Focus, paradoxically, expands the horizon, because you're no longer too distracted to notice what truly matters. This kind of life doesn't draw attention on social media, but it sustains something far rarer. Inner peace with direction. You know where you're investing your energy. You know why you wake up in the morning. And that creates a quiet confidence in your own path, one that doesn't depend on constant applause. And perhaps most importantly, this way of living is accessible. It doesn't require genius or perfect conditions. It only requires the courage to choose and the humility to sustain that choice every day. It's simple but not easy. And that's exactly why it's transformative. Now, with all of this integrated, only one thing remains: giving these teachings a human face. Seeing how they show up in ordinary life with imperfections, stumbles, and small victories. That's where a story becomes necessary, not to idealize, but to remind us that all of this begins in the simplest everyday moments. The quiet choice, when a life begins to change. I want to tell you a simple story. It isn't grand or cinematic. That's precisely why it matters. It's the story of an ordinary person. It could be me, it could be you, who lived the way most people do. Busy, tired, and still haunted by the uncomfortable sense that something essential was always being postponed. He woke up early, already late on the inside. The day began with his phone in hand, his mind jumping from message to message, from worry to worry. He worked hard, solved problems, helped people. On the outside he seemed functional. On the inside he felt a quiet but constant emptiness. At night, when everything finally went silent, the question he avoided all day surfaced. Is this all there is? It was in a banal moment, one ordinary night, too tired to distract himself, that he came across The One Thing by Gary Keller. He wasn't looking for productivity. He was looking for relief. And without realizing it, he found clarity. The idea didn't strike like lightning. It landed like a seed, small but persistent. What if the problem wasn't a lack of time, but an excess of dispersion? In the days that followed, he began observing his own life more honestly. He noticed how reactive he was, how often he said yes out of fear, how he confused movement with progress. And for the first time in a long while, he stopped to ask himself that simple, uncomfortable question. What is the one thing that truly matters right now? The answer wasn't heroic. It was quiet, but it was true. He decided to start small. He blocked a short time each day for that one thing. He protected that time the way one protects something sacred. He said no to certain demands. He felt guilt. He felt fear. But he continued. Gradually, something changed. The day became more breathable. His mind less chaotic. Not because life became easy, but because it became aligned. There were stumbles. Days when he slipped back into dispersion. Moments of doubt. But now there was a difference. Awareness. He knew when he was drifting away from what was essential. And he knew how to return. Discipline stopped being punishment and became care. Focus stopped being rigidity and became direction. Mindful productivity began serving life, rather than consuming it. Over time, success also changed shape. It was no longer just external results, but internal coherence. He felt tired at the end of the day, yes, but not empty. There was a calm peace in knowing where his energy had been invested. Profound simplicity brought something rare, quiet confidence in his own path. This story doesn't end with applause, extraordinary achievements, or perfect resolutions. It ends with something more powerful, a daily choice. The choice to live with presence and awareness, to honor essential decisions, to understand that meaningful success isn't about doing everything, it's about doing what matters.